There's racism in the Ukraine. There are racist Ukrainians. So let me do it this way, because I think people will blur the lines. I'm anti-war, but as my grandmother would say, I got plenty of walking around sense. What Putin is doing in Ukraine is wrong. It's morally wrong. What some Ukrainians are doing to black people inside of their country is wrong as well, and racist as hell. Now, reporters who are reporting on this are also showing their extreme racism in how they contextualize European countries. And I'm going to break all of this down in real time. Let me take you to the first video.
Now with the Russians marching in, it's changed the calculus entirely. Tens of thousands of people have tried to flee the city. There will be many more. People are hiding out in bomb shelters. But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. So it's partly human nature, but they are not in denial.
I'm sorry, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
And so, of course, I understand and respect the emotion. What you are outlining there is this tension between longer term efforts to apply pressure to Vladimir Putin, such as financial sanctions, and the very immediate military threat which you're experiencing.
Just to put it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine. I mean, that, quite frankly, is part of it. These are Christians, they're white, they're very similar to people who live in Poland.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
This is Europe. These are good Christian white people. I mean, they're civilized, as the first reporter said. It's not like Iraq. These aren't refugees from Syria. They should be ashamed of themselves. They are human beings. Bias, prejudice, systemic racism on display in international journalism, and you just saw it. Remember, one lady said, they're white Christians, as if somehow their lives, because they happen to be white or belong to a particular religious category, their lives are much more sophisticated and valuable than those who are not. Now, they may not see it that way because their bias could likely be implicit. I don't give a damn which one it is. The impact of it is the same. The impact of hyper-aggressive bias and implicit bias is the same for the person on the other side of the bias. Those were just a few clips. Let me give you some more background, all right? Cities under siege across the Ukraine are home to tens and thousands of African students studying medicine, engineering, and military affairs. Morocco, Nigeria, and Egypt are among the top 10 countries with foreign students in Ukraine, together supplying over 16,000 students, according to the education ministry. Thousands of Indian students are also trying to flee. What was meant to be a cheaper alternative to studying in Western Europe or the United States has turned overnight into a war zone as Russian tanks, planes, and ships launched the biggest European invasion of another nation since World War II. With flights grounded, African governments thousands of miles away are struggling to support their students. The students Reuters spoke to said they have had no help from home. I'm gonna give you more to this. Now, we have video, we have seen images of Ukrainians stopping black travelers from getting on trains, stopping their movement in favor of whites. We have seen this. We have also seen the Twitter feeds of individuals who are giving us updates as they come. This is racist. Now, here's what's going to happen. You see, Putin is well aware that the international community is against what he's doing, by and large, okay? Obviously, there's some exception. He's going to use this against Ukraine, and it will continue to be a public relations nightmare. It's a war inside of a war. The race dynamic or the racial injustice is the war that has already been there before this war started, because racism is a global dynamic, not simply contextualized through the American experience. And if the leadership of Ukraine, if they don't step up and denounce what Ukrainians are doing, you will see other nations, especially those connected to Africa, they will start not supporting the Ukraine fight against Russia. That will happen. There's more. Here are some stories shared across Twitter. Stephanie Haggerty said, a Nigerian medical student at Poland-Ukraine border told me she has been waiting 7 hours to cross. She says border guards are stopping black people and sending them to the back of the queue, saying they have to let Ukrainians through first. Dr. Alakija, black Africans are being treated with racism and contempt in Ukraine and Poland. We cannot ask African nations to stand in solidarity with them if they do not display basic respect for us, even in a time of war. Ignored in a pandemic and left to die in a war, unacceptable. Now let's get back to some of the coverage, all right? The racist coverage that you just saw. CBS News senior foreign correspondent Charlie D. Agata apologized Saturday, saying for suggesting the war in Ukraine is particularly shocking because the country is relatively civilized and European compared to Iraq and Afghanistan. His characterization was among a flurry of similar commentary in the media that critics have slammed as racist and in some cases, historically inaccurate. So let me tell you one case where it's historically inaccurate. My first PhD, finished in 2016, talks about the warfare that has been waged across this globe in the name of religion. The number one colonizers and the number one catalyst for warfare are white people, white nations. That's not my opinion. That is a fact, and you can find all of my research and go to Google Scholars, Amazon, is all published, all right? So that's one inaccuracy for sure, that somehow white nations are just too civilized for warfare. D. Agata responded to the criticism during a Saturday report saying, and I quote, "I spoke in a way that I regret, and for that I'm sorry." He said what he'd been trying to convey was that Ukraine had not seen war on this scale in recent years compared to conflicts he'd covered in other parts of the world. You can do that without using tropes, all right? This is extreme. There are so many more examples. Ms. Dahl, okay? When you heard this kind of reporting, when you saw it, I know this had to hit you too. What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, my father's family is from the Middle East, and hearing, first of all, the reason why there's decades of war there is because we started that war. And her description, it was heartbreaking that the Syrian refugees were turned away in Europe after what they were going through. And her description of them was just wrong. They were actually highly educated in Syria. And so we mischaracterize the Middle East over and over and over. And in terms of global racism, I think you're absolutely right. I've always thought that actually. I think in some ways, we just talk about it more here. We have freedom of speech, we have democracy, and we're able to have these conversations. But perhaps we have less racism here than in other places. And so I'm glad that you're bringing this up. And it is during terms of war that the most vulnerable of any community gets impacted the most. So it's really such a bad situation that they're in, and I'm really so sorry for that.
We stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters who are being discriminated against. We stand up for historically marginalized communities. We make absolutely no ambiguity about that. I also must echo the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he stood against the Vietnam War. And he said, when America is at war, it has a way of desensitizing those in the country because the policies that we're fighting for take a back burner during wartime. So I want everyone to be reminded we have a war right here in America that we're fighting on the social front every day. Don't lose focus of that as well.